Okay, so let's talk about how to actually survive an AWS outage. So AWS went down today and they had a major outage. They had Snapchat was down, Fortnite was down, Zoom was down, every single thing, even their own services, like completely offline. And this wasn't just some sort of blip in network traffic. This was like full outage. Nobody could get any single access to their services. Tons of downstream systems were just down. And this really got me thinking, as a SaaS entrepreneur and a SaaS founder, what would it take to actually survive an outage like this? And the question is, can you actually survive it? And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Any cloud provider can go down, okay? So I just want to be clear with that. But the real question is, can you actually mitigate those outages? And can you actually do it in a way that's cost effective, which is even more important? Because of course, you could have your services in AWS and just replicate it. The problem is it comes at a really hefty bill. So today I want to show you different things that you could do to prevent a major outage like what happened with some of these SaaS vendors today. Now, obviously I don't know a lot of details about these SaaS companies and how they run their service, so I'm not talking about them specifically. What I'm doing is basically giving you a framework that you can use to ensure that if you're building a SaaS application, you can use Cloudflare's network to mitigate a lot of the issues around your solution. So if you're like most startups using AWS, you're probably using DynamoDB, Lambda functions, S3, Route 53 for DNS, and maybe a few other services altogether. The problem with this is that generally speaking, you're kind of locked into one region unless you have sort of a multi-region sort of strategy, which as we know is very costly. So most providers just basically just plump their data in one region and just pray and hope for the best that they're not going to have an outage. Now, the problem doesn't just stem from the fact that you just have your data in one region. The problem also is the fact that you might have other dependency systems like Auth0 or Stripe or OpenAI or whatever it is that could potentially go down also because of sort of the ripple effect. So in order to mitigate this, we have to think about how to distribute our cloud services very differently so that we can sort of maximize uptime altogether. Now, no surprise here, the answer to this particular conversation is Cloudflare. Now, what I'm going to do is walk you through technology that you could use within Cloudflare to help really mitigate these risks and do it at a very economical cost in order to ensure that you give your user experience the best user experience even in an outage. So, but before we actually jump into the details, let's just talk about what's going on with AWS and why this service went down, why it actually impacted a lot of people altogether. So apparently this service actually went down in the AWS region. And just to be clear, I don't actually have any inside knowledge from the guys over at AWS on what actually happened. So this is just what I've read online and my understanding of how their services works. So my understanding is that East US, which is sitting in Virginia, is actually a really big hub for them, EAST, East US. And so as a result, a lot of their traffic goes through that region. So this means that their DNS, things like Route 53, their DNS lookups and stuff like that, a lot of it kind of centralized in that region. So what does that mean? That means because we also had some services in Canada. So what would happen is, let's say there was a user here in Canada that actually was trying to look up something or visit some sort of website. What would happen is when their traffic hits their ISP, that traffic would sometimes get rerouted down to, say, East US and then go on to its destination. And let's say you have another service from some other company that you're trying to visit here in another part of the US, it's possible that that would hit the East US region before bouncing to its destination. So that's essentially what happened. So as you can imagine, there's tons of traffic and DNS lookup and all kinds of stuff that's sort of centralized in this region. Now, to add insult to injury, it also turns out that DynamoDB, which is their platform for their NoSQL database, is also located in this region, one of the regions. And as a result, there was a DNS error that basically prevented their database from resolving DNS records, and I guess the database had an outage, and as a result, anybody that was hosted in that region couldn't actually connect to that database, and so they had tons of downstream services that were affected. So if it's not already clear, you can see a big problem here, which is the fact that you have all of the data for your database and for DNS lookup all sitting in one location. That is why this outage was such a big disaster for AWS, and why it's probably going to cost them, if not hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. So with that in mind, the only way that you were able to mitigate some of these problems is essentially you could have another set of database services in another region. So let's say that you had it in West US as an example. You would have your services there, and you would have some sort of duplication that's happening between these two. So, and then you would have to have some sort of global DNS, okay, that whenever, let's go back with the same scenario, we have traffic from here, it hits the ISP, then it would sort of hit this global DNS. The DNS would sort of predicted already or figured out that there was a problem here, and so it would automatically route your traffic over to the next region altogether. Okay, so that's the general strategy that most most traditional SaaS providers would take. The problem is that you're basically paying for both services twice, and this is really the problem, because if you're paying $100 here, it means you're paying $100 here exactly, and that alone translates to just time and money to make sure that both services are running identical, they have the same replication of the data, etc., etc. And you as an IT person just spend an enormous amount of time making sure and mitigating these sort of data routing issues, data duplication issues. Okay, so with that foundational knowledge out the way, let's talk about Cloudflare and how Cloudflare is different in this particular scenario. And then we're going to talk about the different things that you could do in order to mitigate your risk with ensuring that your application is always up, or at least degrades in a very, very seamless manner. So one of the hardest things to be able to do is replicate your database. So let's pretend for a second that your SaaS solution, and you only, because you didn't want to pay the extra cost to duplicate your data, you only had your DynamoDB data in this region. So with Cloudflare's network, the way how Cloudflare is set up is they have multiple regions across the different cities, north of 320 or more regions all across. In this case, I'm just going to do North America, but all across the globe. Okay. So the first things first is that the way how their system works is that, let's go back with the same exact scenario. If a user hits their network, if a user hits your ISP, and then it's going to hit the Cloudflare network. The way how their DNS system is set up is that it's a global anycast system, which means the DNS lookup goes to multiple cups at the exact same time. There's no one central point of failure. This is the way how they built their network from the ground up. So it's basically an edge network and an edge DNS resolution system that routes your DNS to n number of regions or location at once. So even if one goes down, you would literally have to take down the entire network in order for you to not be able to resolve your DNS. So that's one problem, and that's one way to start mitigating risk altogether with their DNS and their global load balancing system. The second thing you would do is basically have your workers, your Cloudflare workers, sitting at the edge. And the Cloudflare workers are essentially your replacement for Lambda. So instead of having your Lambda function sitting in that one region, you would have your Cloudflare workers replicated across multiple different regions. Same thing. DNS request comes in, it gets routed to any one of the locations. Even if you have 5 or 6 different regions that are out at the same time, you still have to hit all of them. The important thing here is that you're not doing that DNS routing and you're not doing that DNS sort of lookup. At some point in time, you're going to have to go back to your database for data. That's just inevitable. If you only have one database in that central region, you're going to have to go back to there for your data. So the next service that could help to mitigate that particular situation is their KV store. And with their KV store, essentially what you would do is whenever your request hits sort of the worker would then go out to the KV store, which is basically a caching layer, and try to get a hit on that data. If it doesn't have a hit, it would then go back to your database. Now, whenever that data comes back in, you would basically cache it so that the next request hits the cache. And again, we're dealing with a globally scalable distributed system so that this prevents any sort of single point of failure. The other service that you would then add to this list is basically their Cloudflare's queuing service. And essentially it's exactly what it is. It's a queue system that basically is also distributed so that in the event that a request comes in and you need to process it, you would take that request first, drop it in the Cloudflare queue, and then send it off to whatever backend system that you have in AWS. Now, the reason for doing this is the fact that in exactly a situation like this where you have an AWS outage, all those requests for writes that would come in, they would just sit in the queue and just basically sit there and wait until DynamoDB comes back on, whether it's 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever it is. And once that backend system comes online, then it can sort of start routing traffic to the database, to whatever backend service, to your Lambda function, etc., in order to make things work properly. Now, Cloudflare also has their own D1 database implementation that is resilient and is globally distributed. It basically gets replicated to the region that you're in, but it has a bunch of resiliency built into it that prevents a single point of failure altogether. The challenge with a D1 database is that a DynamoDB in this particular case is a NoSQL database, and D1 database is a relational database table. It's actually an SQLite under the hood. So that's a challenge altogether. Now, I'm not saying that you would go and replace your D1 database with a D1 database. That would just be ridiculous. You wouldn't do that. However, what you can do is take certain workloads that are sitting in your DynamoDB and distribute them with a D1 database. Things like settings or user configuration, that sort of stuff, so that you have a more distributed type of system. This way, in the event that you have a failure on your core backend data, on your core backend infrastructure, things like initial configuration, authentication, that sort of stuff could kind of sit in this sort of edge network that brings the resiliency that allows for some sort of gradual or degraded experience, but not a full-on outage. And at the end of the day, that's basically what the goal is. It's a trade-off between a full outage, user still experiencing some sort of user experience with some services or features that are not available, and you having to deal with a lot of unhappy customers. So it's really about mitigating that risk. That's the one important thing that I want you to take away from this video. And the important thing to understand here is that really having a cache smart system is sort of like the way to go, right? Where you're not, caching necessarily everything, but you're really caching those critical sort of happy paths where it's really important for the user to have a good experience, to be able to keep the application online. That is not necessarily, time sensitive information. If the user gets some stale data, it's not necessarily going to impact their experience or any sort of decision that they have to make altogether. Listen, as a founder, one of the things that I could tell you off the top is that having outages can definitely impact your customers' trust. It could increase churn, right? Like, no customer actually cares that AWS had an outage. I mean, you could tell them AWS had an outage, but that means nothing to them. At the end of the day, they care about the fact that they have given you money to provide a service, and that service is down. They don't care. So for that reason, it really, really matters that you maintain a high level of trust. And one of the best ways that you can do that is with Cloudflare. Now, the good news here is that you can do this replication, and in some ways, I will argue it's going to be significantly cheaper than what you're currently paying for your AWS service. So it's not like you're compromising on infrastructure by switching from AWS to Cloudflare. And to be clear, I'm not telling you to go switch all your workloads tomorrow to Cloudflare and they're going to save the world, because Cloudflare does have outages also. However, mitigating that risk by spreading it in a globally distributed system that is by design globally distributed makes a lot of sense. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you see an AWS outage or an Azure outage, ask yourself the question, would your app survive? And if not, I think it's time for you to start thinking about Flare. And just to be clear, I'm not a spokesperson for Cloudflare. I'm just really passionate about some of the things that I'm seeing that Cloudflare is doing that none of the other big three providers are really doing in a similar way or at scale with the price points that they have. It's just a phenomenal service altogether. And I really, really believe in what those guys are doing. So with that, let me know if you want to do more deep dive on this type of content. and I'm going to try to put together more specific details on how you could actually move your workloads off of AWS if that's something you're interested in, and put some comments on your experience and how you're sort of mitigating your own app experience. At the end of the day, it's not a zero-sum game. There's trade-offs to having different platforms. You just have to do what's best for you as an organization based on where you are as a company, what type of services you're looking for, and at the end of the day, what sort of outage risks you're willing to take. So with that, hopefully you've gotten some value from this video. I do a lot of talks about Cloudflare and all the things that are going on with Cloudflare. I focus on developer-specific Cloudflare type of solutions. So if you're interested in that, feel free to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in another video. Have yourself a wonderful day.